Jessie Marion King, Scotland's greatest illustrator, lived most of her life in Kirkcudbright, the artist's town. During a working life of over 60 years, Jessie M. King's creativity flowed into books, murals, pottery, jewellery, fabric and costume. She became an internationally renowned artist and illustrator, gaining commissions from all over Europe and exhibiting her work as far as America and India. Jessie M. King was also blessed with second sight. Her claim that she could communicate with fairies, along with her mythical subject matter, gave her a reputation as the creator of dreams.
She's certainly one of Scotland's best known illustrators, and I think an illustrator is almost a profession in its own. It's like a musician whose talent is being an accompanist.
Then I discovered she did stained glass, then I discovered she did ceramics, then I discovered she did batik work, and so it goes on. She's a very dangerous lady to start collecting, I'll tell you.
It was her technical acumen, her sheer drawing ability, which allowed her to produce work of a very high standard in a variety of different styles and types.
Jessie was one of 5 children of the Reverend James King of Bearsden and his wife Mary Anderson. She was born in New Kilpatrick Parish, just outside Glasgow, on the 20th of March 1875.
Being a child of the manse was rather an unusual position, because generally the children of ministers were highly educated. They had a genteel upbringing, but they weren't particularly wealthy, so they usually had to make their way in the world. Now, art offered a real opportunity for women in the late 19th and, well, throughout the 20th century. It's one of the few areas where opportunities were there.
At the local school, Jessie demonstrated a gift for drawing. The teacher encouraged her to attend Glasgow School of Art. For Jessie, the appeal of Britain's finest art institution was too much to ignore.
Her mother didn't like her drawing. Her mother didn't think it was art was not for young girls, so she didn't like it. And when Jessie used to do drawings at school, she used to hide them in the bushes on the way home, and where she knew she could get them again, you know. But her father encouraged her.
Eventually, she was allowed to apply for the diploma course with a view to becoming an art teacher.
This is a period when women were first coming into areas of higher education, universities, colleges and art schools, and Glasgow was in the vanguard there.
In 1892, she registered under the newly appointed principal, Fra Newbery.
Of course, he was Francis Newbery. That was, Fra was short for Francis. He came up as a young man from London and took over Glasgow School of Art. And he was very, very interested in the modern arts, and particularly in crafts. He was also a feminist before the word was known.
She didn't actually get on terribly well to start with. It was only a good bit later when someone like Newbery, the headmaster, took an interest in her and discovered her forte for line drawing and encouraged her to go up that road rather than the mainstream, that she really came into her own.
And that was very important, because there were a number of women at that time, like Jessie King, who were just beginning. They were young, they were in their early 20s, and here was this new director who took them seriously.
He encouraged the whole crowd of them at that period, you know, the MacDonald sisters and Jessie King. And it's not to say that without his influence that they wouldn't have made it on their own, but he was enormously well connected in England, and he ensured that Glasgow School of Art students entered the South Kensington competitions. And the beauty about that was that Europe kept an eye on the South Kensington competitions, so if they won medals there, then people in Europe who were interested in Art Nouveau immediately had their name in front of them, and Jessie was one of the ones who benefited from that.
At the art school, Jessie learnt how to experiment with line and form, how a group of dots could be used to create different shapes. It was the Art Nouveau artist Aubrey Beardsley who had the biggest impact on Jessie's emerging style. Inspired by Japanese art and 15th century woodcuts, he produced striking and dynamic work that captivated the young Jessie. Along with fellow students at the art school, she celebrated an unusual world of literature and legends from bygone days. They would often stage mock historical processions. Jessie designed many of the costumes for these pageants and enjoyed taking part herself. This enchanted world soon came to dominate her illustrative work.
I think this fascination with myth, legend, fairy tale is partly a reaction against industrialisation. But beyond that, I think there was a genuine longing for a deeper meaning in these fairy tales and myths. So when Jessie M. King illustrates, these are not just little stories for children. They tap into quite deep and profound patterns of our knowledge and our culture.
In 1898, Jessie graduated from the art school with a first. It was at this time she met her future husband, Ernest A. Taylor, a handsome designer and painter working in Glasgow.
It was a love match to begin with, certainly. Taylor was, as far as I can gather, I'm talking to people who knew him, you know, he was very much an actor. I mean, the photograph of him is almost like an actor, you know. But I think it was a very, very good marriage, a very fruitful marriage. I think they fed one another.
During this fruitful period, Jessie's work became very popular on the continent, as well as in Britain. She won many prizes and competitions, including the great 1902 exhibition in Turin.
Jessie M. King's early work in particular is unique for its meticulous detail. Working on vellum as she did rather than paper, it required her to be exact, almost beyond normal, human ability.
The early manner was very popular throughout Europe. Very popular, particularly in Germany, and in a number of other centres. She did illustrations for German magazines and albums, and these were very highly regarded. But it was a style that was reliant on very fine pen and ink drawing. So it was primarily black and white, with just a few areas of colour to elaborate it, and the colour applied very sparingly.
In 1908, Jessie and Ernest married. A year later, their only child, Merrill, was born. In love and with an adventurous spirit, they set off for the artistic capital of the world, Paris.
Taylor was the Paris correspondent of Studio magazine, which was probably the best artistic magazine in the world at that time. So everybody who was anybody sought them out. And they obviously had a wonderful life.
Jessie and Ernest loved Paris. Attitudes towards art were much freer than in Britain, and within a year they had set up their own art school. Jessie was exposed to a world which before had only existed in her imagination, and her work flourished.
Jessie King's period in Paris certainly put her at the centre of the European avant-garde, and Paris was certainly a great metropolis for cultural activity. And quite interestingly, at the time, by far the most important cultural and visual art influence was the Ballet Russe.
The Ballet Russe and Bakst and whatnot were, hit the scene with like a bomb going off.
The Ballyroos brought together costume designers, artists, musicians, composers, as well as dancers, to create what at the time was described as a Gesamtkunstwerk, a total artwork, which was just an assault on the senses.
And of course everything to do with them was coloured. And you can actually see Jessie's work change from almost restrained British colours, if you like, to way out, thoroughly bright colours. You know, you can draw a line when it actually changes. It's quite remarkable.
With the outbreak of the First World War, Jessie and Ernest returned to Britain. They settled in what was to become their home for the rest of their lives, Kirkcudbright. Jessie M. King, Scotland's greatest illustrator, settled with her husband Ernest Taylor in the border town of Kirkcudbright in 1915.
I never actually met Jessie M. King, obviously, but I'm often struck by the stories you hear about her, particularly the one of the American visitor who went into the Selkirk Arms and said, "Gee, I've just seen a witch riding down the street." And of course he was referring to Jessie M. King on a bicycle with a black hat and a cape blowing behind her.
Jessie was joining a small artists' colony that had developed around the celebrated Scottish painter E.A. Hornell. The Galloway countryside and coast surrounding Kirkcudbright lent itself perfectly to painting.
One of the reasons that the Glasgow artists liked Kirkcudbright and that area in the southwest was that it was not wild, dramatic Highland landscape, which had been made rather popular by, the landscapists of the early to high Victorian period. They wanted something that was more rural, traditional and agricultural. And the area around Kirkcudbright was very attractive for that.
Jessie and Ernest moved into the Green Gate, an 18th century house on the High Street. It had its own close of cottages that they rented out to other artists.
My mother and father started off their married life as tenants of Jessie M. King in the Green Gate Close. This was quite unusual, and when my father was struggling to find a house to rent, Jessie M. King did the needful and offered them one of the cottages down the Green Gate. So it must have been a real thrill for my parents that when they returned from their honeymoon, they discovered that Jessie M. King had decorated the cobblestones and the doorsteps in the cottages down the close with designs to commemorate the occasion of them coming home, which I think principally featured a prince bringing his princess back to his palace. Nice way to start your married life.
By this time, Jessie was an internationally recognised artist and craftswoman. While continuing her illustrative work, she was also designing jewellery, silverware and textiles for Liberties in London. Closer to home in Kirkcudbright, the local community was also benefiting from her talents.
She did a friend's tea room in Kirkcudbright, the Paul Jones tea room, and the other side of the deal was that she would be allowed to sell her painted ceramics through the tea room. But she was obviously also very generous with all the locals, because the number of christening mugs or things with people's names on, specific names on, that she gave them as presents. It's just amazing how many folk have got them.
At the time when she was alive, we didn't think anything about it. I ate my porridge out of a Jessie M. King bowl and drank my cup of milk out of a Jessie M. King mug. And
the vast majority of her ceramic work is signed with JMK initials, the Green Gate, which is where they lived, and the rabbit.
Jessie had a reputation as a local eccentric. She had an otherworldly quality. This mysterious aspect of her personality often featured in her work. Around the heads of her elegant figures, she would often draw circles of stars, not halos as many thought, but auras, that Jessie claimed she could see.
It's said that she was a very fey person, and certainly we know that she might come up to you and say, "Oh, you're looking very, I can see a purple shade to you today." She could see colours around people.
She'd say, you know, you remind me of a hare or a fawn or a wee rabbit or something. And she something the word all that flat. I remember a boy, I think he was called a ferret. But most of them were all right.
It's recounted that she didn't speak down to children. She actually got down and spoke to children, you know, on her haunches. And at the time, that was rather remarkable. You know, children were expected to be seen and not heard, but Jessie would actually make a point of talking directly to the children. And there are people in the town who've often told me that this was, you know, quite a remarkable thing, and the thing they remember about Jessie as a young child actually being addressed directly by this adult who would take the trouble of actually, you know, speaking to them sort of face to face.
Oh well, when I was smaller, we all had autograph albums, and I thought that it was time that I had something with Jessie M. King's in it. So I just went along one day and asked if she'd do me a wee drawing, which she did, and I've got it here in my autograph album. I expect quite a lot of children in the town will have things by her, but it's probably only nowadays that people wish they had gone along and got an autograph from her. It's a nice wee painting. It's what she has on the bottom of all her pottery. So it's nice to have anyway, just a wee personal thing rather than just buying something.
I think a lot of artists respond to children because they see in children's ideas, and particularly in children's drawings, a purity that's often debased by later experiences. So similarly, a lot of great artists are accused of producing work of a childlike quality, which to them is actually a compliment because that's what they're trying to achieve.
Jessie's love of children led her to publish a book, which through a fairy story explained how it was possible to make a toy town of Kirkcudbright. She called the book The Little Town of Neverweary and dedicated it to her own daughter, Merrill. In a copy she presented to the painter E.A. Hornell, she wrote of her affection for the town. I think it was a very happy wind which blew me into Kirkcudbright some 11 years ago, and a happier chance which elected to show us a dwelling where one might rest in this pot of the lowlands. I have, but inadequately, caught the glamour and the allure of its gables and whitewashed alleys, its mellowing chimneys huddled together as if in sympathetic communion with the stars. But my gratitude is to it and its fair welcome, and to those who have made its welcome so human. The charm of Kirkcudbright continues to inspire artists today. Carice Worthington has been living in the Greengate Close for the last 2 years.
When I came here on my own, I could feel the spirit of the place. I mean, the sort of the essence of what it was all about. And I realised that, you know, if I was going to paint, it was going to be here. You really do get a sense of, not her ghostly presence, of course, but a presence of her passion and her power. And her creativity still exists in the place, and it's very inspiring. She was flamboyant and she was daring for her time, and I think that still exists. People still tune into that she dared to change her style, that she dared to change her medium. I mean, that was really quite something. When she was making money from being an illustrator, you know, the sort of sensible thing to do would be to stick to illustration. But of course she didn't. She changed because she wanted to change, you know, because she had to change, because her ideas changed and she grew and developed.
Jessie Marion King died peacefully on 3rd of August 1949 at the age of 73. In memory of his beloved wife, Ernest Archibald Taylor wrote, "May there still be many sheaves to glean in our love's acre, comrade, till the end, and may we find when ended is the page, death but a tavern on our pilgrimage." Her last photograph shows her standing outside the green gate, waving cheerily as the wind fusses her hair.
She wasn't complicated in what she did, she just did it. You know, it came from a deeper part of herself, and she was creative. She let her creativity flow, she gave it its freedom.
I think Jessie, in a sense, is unique in that she didn't directly influence a lot of people to do the same kind of thing. And as the style wasn't passed on to half a dozen students who then produced similar work. But she certainly must have influenced people, I don't think there's any question about that.
I find it interesting that somebody who had lived in Paris, lived a bohemian lifestyle in Paris, was designing for liberties, was an international competition winner, could still see it as a reasonable thing to do to come to a tiny town in a fairly obscure corner of Scotland and involve herself in the community. She seemed outwardly to be less concerned about her international reputation than actually contributing to life and society in this very small town. And I think she did it absolutely par excellence.